Hey, welcome back. In this video, I want to talk about reducers. What a reducer is just another way for you to modify your state in a different way. It allows you to take our logic kind of out of our component and put it into a function in itself. And I don't typically use reducers, mostly because it's just not a very good way to work. I don't think the idea of moving your logic out into something else, like a function, is a fundamentally very good idea. And especially the more complex components you build in the future, you'll realize that it gets difficult to put all the code in the component itself. It just makes everything extremely messy. But the reason why I don't typically use reducers is because they're just not flexible enough. And so rather than coding along this time, I actually had to sit down and write the reducer myself because this isn't something I typically do. But let's just run through what a reducer does very quickly, and then we'll talk about what the cons are. Okay. So, like I mentioned before, a reducer is basically just a function, and we have a reducer function right here. Okay. So, um, it's very simple. It's a function reducer, right? And it takes two parameters or two arguments. The first one is the state we're trying to modify, right? And then some kind of action, which is some kind of object that describes what the action is. Um, so if we go up here, we can see that in my case, I have defined an action as type, as an interface of action, right? And this interface has one property of type, and it's the property type has a type of action type, and if we look up here, these are basically our actions. I want to increment our first counter, and our other action is to increment our second counter, just like in our previous examples, right? We have this on click, which uh, would increase our first counter by 1, and then we had a second click that increases our second counter by 2, right? So instead of a reducer function, right, we just switch on this action type. And so if it's increment counter, then we modify and return our state. This function returns a new state after it does whatever modifying it does need to it. And you'll notice that the syntax is the same here as it is here. I left this in the comment basically so that you can see that these are basically doing the exact same thing, right? Just we've kind of taken the logic out and we've moved it into a function rather than calling it here. So as we move down here, we can see that we have a new way of doing this here. So we have useReducer is a hook that we are using here. And it starts getting a little bit messy here and with the types essentially, but if I take this out here, this probably will make it a little bit easier to understand, right? And actually, we don't even need this third parameter if we don't want it. But this looks a lot like the previous way we set up our state, but instead of using useState, we use useReducer, and it takes two arguments the useReducer hook does, and the first one is the reducer function, which we have wrote here, and the second is the state, and then there can be a optional, this is your initial state, and then there can be another function that derives your state from your initial state that we could call here as well. But this is typically about how I would probably do it most of the time. And of course, it returns a tuple, just like useState does. And the first one is, first value is your state. And the second is a dispatch function. And what a dispatch function is when you call the dispatch function, it applies whatever you pass into it to the reducer. So as we come down here and we see our onClick function here, right? We're using the dispatch function to dispatch and call, say, like we want to take this action. And this action here is the same as the action that we would pass here. So this dispatch function is going to call our reducer. It's going to pass in the current state along with the action that we want, which is right here. And then this reducer runs, right? In this case, increment counter is the action that we pass in. So it would pass in our state and this action object that looks like this. And then we would catch it here, switch it here. And then here is the action of increment counter, as the same as here, and then it would run this statement here and return the new state. So, this is the basic idea of reducers. It's just another way for you to move the logic out into another function. It makes it a little easier in some ways for more complex components. You can also pass this dispatch, for example, to another component and then call the action from that component if you wanted to. So that's a handy thing that it can do as well. But the reason why reducers aren't very good is because they're kind of limited in what you can do, obviously, because you have this action here, and depending on how complex your component is, exactly how you type this out is just kind of a nightmare, because different components could have any number of actions, depending on how complex they are, and it just kind of becomes very hard to get everything to play properly. If your component is very simple, like the component that we have here, then this is not a terrible idea, because basically, for our actions are very simple. We just want to increase, for example, a counter by 1. So in this sense, in this very simple component, this kind of makes a lot of sense, but in bigger components, it just doesn't really make a lot of sense. So I would recommend you don't use this. You can if you want. In the next video, I'm going to show you my concept of controllers, which is kind of this same idea, but just done in a way that makes a lot more sense for really any component. We'll talk about that in the next video, and I'll see you there.